This is Winchester Academy.
It's fun to talk about weird, cool things that occur in lakes and wetlands, things that will get people excited about the lake or the wetland next door. Many of these things are fairly small, so they're not things that you would really notice unless somebody kind of points it out to you ahead of time. Can anyone name what these three things are on the cover slide? Any of them? Freshwater jellyfish in the middle, yeah. We do have those around here. Sundew on the left, good. And okay, that's a caddisfly. We'll talk about that. That's one that has been sort of domesticated. That is a caddisfly who is in a tank full of precious metals, building cases out of these things so that the person can sell them. So it's a pet caddisfly, an indentured servant or something. So this is an example of a wetland. Believe it or not, you may not think of this as a wetland. The person who owns this wetland is in the audience, actually. This is one of my favorite wetlands. This is, in fact, water would be just below your feet here. You would probably get wet socks if you walked around here, but it is mostly dry, but full of all kinds of neat things like this Coreopsis here, it used to be Coreopsis, now it's changed. Taxonomists, they like to change names of things. But it's one of our former native Coreopsis species. Now that we've got these beautiful gold tamaracks in the back, a big sedge meadow in here. Part of this is a bog, so we have acid-loving species like sphagnum mosses and leatherleaf and Labrador tea and other neat species like that. But there's also wetlands that aren't quite as pretty to the average eye, like this, where it's just really sloppy and hard to launch a boat, and not a whole lot of really showy things in the picture, but still a lot of interesting things if you look closely and just take some time to look around. So, unfortunately, some perceptions of wetlands are they smell. They're full of mosquitoes, witches, and ogres, like Shrek lives there. Other yucky things. Good place to put your old tires when they're worn down. Throw them in the wetland. When I was still in college, I was living in an apartment where there was the whole apartment complex was built on a wetland. Actually, they filled a big chunk of this wetland. But I would walk back into this wetland sometimes, and there were several little ponds, and they were full of turtles and marsh marigolds and other neat things in there. And there was a pond where there was about a dozen tires and a couch in the pond. And I went in there with hip boots, and I took all the tires out, and I took them down to the waste transfer facility in Plover, south of where I live. And I paid $2 to get rid of each one of these things. And then within a month, there was a new set of tires in the pond. So it still happens. It's certainly something that used to happen a lot more often, but some people still see wetlands as kind of wastelands. It's convenient downhill, so you can push whatever downhill, and it ends up in the wetland. And, unfortunately, that still does happen. It's also where this person lives. Jenny Greenteeth is a legendary creature in the UK that drowns children that get too close to wetlands. So depicted in the picture here, this stuff here is duckweed, and Jenny is thought to be made of duckweed. And so if a kid gets too close to the duckweed, she'll reach out in there and grab the kid in it and drown him. And the thought behind this was that it was originally thought people were trying to discourage kids from basically trying to walk on the duckweed, because it gets very thick and it almost looks like land. And so kids would walk on that or think they were going to run across it, and then they would drown. And so we think people were trying to scare their kids into not going by the duckweed because Jenny was going to come out and get them. So let's talk about this one first, starting with some really interesting plants. What's this one? It's a pitcher plant. We do have one species of pitcher plant, the purple pitcher plant in Wisconsin. It's fairly common on bogs or fens. A bog is an area where there's a lot of moss and peat that is very acidic, usually fed by rainwater, not by groundwater, which keeps it more acid. And then a fen is a similar type of habitat, but instead of being acid, it's more alkaline. It's in contact with a lot of groundwater, with a lot of minerals in it. So around here, with our very hard water in the central sands, and south of here, there are fens kind of scattered around. So it's an area of a lot of peat with a very alkaline substrate. And that's the sort of habitat that pitcher plants like. They like to be in that peat. Whether it's acid or alkaline, they don't really care. But either way, it's a difficult environment because both of those environments tend to be very cold, and organic matter decomposition is pretty slow in those habitats. And nitrogen and other nutrients and minerals are hard to come by for these plants. So they supplement their nutrition by eating bugs. And this one, you can see the bugs in here. These pitchers face upward, the opening faces upward so that they can capture rainwater, and they hold this water. And they have a hood here that is covered in long spikes, essentially, if you're a tiny little critter. They're little hairs, but they look like spikes if you're a 1/4 inch long. And then the inside of the pitcher here, starting right over here and going downward, is very slippery, as is this edge right here. So this plant, it doesn't really have a way, the insect has to have a reason to go into the pitcher. And what this plant has done is to have little nectar glands underneath this edge, so that an ant or something will crawl up and it will lead its head over and try to get to the nectar glands that are behind that lip. And ideally, they will fall in. Sometimes they do. If they don't, the nectar also has just a little bit of alcohol in it. So the longer they sip from the nectar glands, the more likely it is that they're going to tumble their way into the pitcher plant. So then they eventually end up in this water, and this plant does not actually have an enzyme or anything to break down these bugs. Most pitcher plants, the vast majority of them, hundreds of species, are in tropical areas. They grow up on trees, and they grow mostly in tropical rainforests and warmer climates. But this one doesn't have anything that it produces in the water itself. So the plants the bugs would just sit in there and just slowly rot over time. But instead, this one uses a mosquito larva that lives inside the pitcher. And remember, there's no enzymes or anything dangerous about the water in the pitcher. So the mosquitoes actually lay their eggs into the pitcher. And this mosquito, Wyomia smithii is its name. It doesn't have a common name, but that's the Latin name of this mosquito. It lives in the pitcher, and that's the only place in the world that it lives, in this purple pitcher plant. And it shreds up any other insects that go into the pitcher. And then it poops them out, and the plant absorbs the mosquito poop. And that's where it gets its nitrogen and its minerals from. And there's also a midge that lays its eggs in the pitcher also. So there's a small midge also. And either one of those larvae they're carnivorous, predatory larvae, and they will shred up whatever happens to come into that pitcher plant and help the plant to capture nitrogen and minerals. That's a close-up of that hood where all those spikes are. With many pitcher plants, including this one too, the insect falls in and then it tries to climb up the side, but it's too slippery. If it does make it up there, it's encountering these huge spikes, really, that are pointing downwards. There's nothing for that insect to be able to climb up on and get out. So they eventually they get exhausted and they fall back in the water, and then the midge or the mosquito will go after them and tear them up. Okay, so this is an animal. Anyone know what this one is? I get calls and pictures of this one every year where somebody finds this on their dock, or they're fishing and they snag a stick and they pull it out of the water and it's got this big volleyball-sized jelly mass on it. This is my hand here, so you can get an idea. This one is fairly big, fist size, or a little bigger than my fist. This is called a Bryozoan colony. And this is a large group of animals. They're filter-feeding animals, and if you've ever seen a barnacle or something filtering on a seashore, you can see this little comb-like thing that comes out, and it catches little organisms and little plankton in the water and eats those. That's what each of these do as well. So each one of these little bumps here, or over here, is one individual animal. And it has a little comb that comes out of there, and it filter feeds things out of the water. Those jelly masses grow through the season, and it's basically all jelly inside. There's no animals inside. The animals are only on the very outside. But they have to make more jelly in order to make more surface area of this ball so more individuals can colonize that area. So as the colony grows in number, it also grows in size so that there's more surface area for them to colonize. These are really common in slow-flowing water, so reservoirs and impoundments are the most common place that you'll see these. But really, any kind of shallow wetland is a location where you're likely to see these. So the individuals are called zooids, each individual animal, and they're all genetically identical, but they all have different purposes for the colony. So some of them are defensive, and some of them are feeders, and some are reproductive. They all have their own function in the colony, even though they're all genetically identical. This is a different species here, the Craspedacusta. That one, that's in a very soft water bog lake in Lincoln County, colonizing a big branch in the water. But that one, instead of forming these big balls, it just forms this kind of maze shape across the substrate. And that's what an individual one would look like. It's got these little combs that stick out, and then it pulls those in, and whatever is attached to those little comb teeth is then scraped off and fed on. So this is from that same lake. Here's that Craspedacusta back here, and then this big one, the giant Bryozoan. All right, so this one, should we pass things around, Mary?
Sure.
It may take a while, but we can circulate some things around. So I have a live example of this also up here that maybe people can look at later if you want to. You can maybe, these are both the same sort of thing, so you can start one at each end if you want. Somebody probably knows what this is. Bladderwort, yes. We have many bladderworts in Wisconsin. Wort is a Greek word for plant. Bladder refers to these little sacs that are on the leaves. And the bladderworts feed on little critters in the water. This is a carnivorous group of aquatic plants. They're completely in the water. And they have no roots. They just float around in most cases. And they get pushed into very quiet, calm areas by the wind because they have no roots. So they end up tangled around lily pads and things like that. And what else would you find in very calm, quiet, stagnant water breeding? Mosquito larvae, midge larvae, all kinds of small zooplankton would be in those sorts of areas. So it feeds on tiny things, mosquito larvae, midge larvae, daphnia, any kind of little critters. If you scooped up a cup of pond water and you saw little dots swimming around in there, that's what the bladderwort feeds on. And this particular species, the common bladderwort, likes to be pretty much anywhere. You'll find it in all habitats. It's very common in lakes, very common in wetlands of all kinds, as long as there's not much flow. And there are other species that are very much restricted to very acid environments, bog lakes, because it's difficult to grow there with the very high acidity. And they're able to tolerate that and feed on animals instead of just absorbing nutrients. So this is a close-up of one of the bladders here. This is on, there's two specimens going around. The flat-leaf bladderwort, I think, is right over here on the right side. That one has a photosynthetic portion of the plant that is above ground. So it has no bladders. It's just using the sun for energy. And then it has different branches that are completely underground. It has no leaves under there. It has only bladders, and it's eating bugs with that part of the plant. So half the plant uses the sun for energy, half of it captures bugs and eats those. So this is an underground bladder here that you can see. This long branch here is going down into the sediments, several inches at least. And one bladder here is connected to that branch, and on the opposite end, it has several long hairs that just stick out into the water. And there's a valve right here that swings inward, but it cannot swing outward. There's a little lip inside the bladder, so it can only swing one way. The bladder can pump water out of itself, so it can create a little vacuum inside, low pressure area inside. And when an insect or a small zooplankton touches those hairs, it causes that valve to swing inward, and a little rush of water will get pulled in there, and whatever happens to be next to those trigger hairs is going for a little ride on that wave of water. And then it gets inside that bladder. As pressure builds in here, the door slams shut, and the bug is then stuck inside. So there's no enzymes or anything in this one either. It just rots inside, and the plant will pump the water out again. And as that organism is decaying inside, then it absorbs the minerals and the nitrogen from that insect's body to supplement the nutrition of the plant. And what you see in here, here's the valve. When that wave came in here, this insect right here came riding that wave in, and then it built up over here, and it started curving back, and here's that bug that rode the wave in and got stuck. So that's probably a midge larva or a mosquito larva, a long, narrow critter. So unless you like mosquitoes, you should like bladderworts. And they're pretty. These are all the flowers of them. They are all insect-pollinated, showy flowers. 2 purples and 6 yellow ones. Sometimes you'll see 5 or 6 of those in an individual lake, different species. There's only a couple places in central Wisconsin where you can see one of the purple ones. Around Watoma, there's a couple of them. So this is an example of what a lot of aquatic plants use for their primary reproduction mechanisms. Instead of producing seed, many of them produce these things called turions, or winter buds, or summer buds in some cases. But it's a dormant bud that is really just a branch of the plant that is highly constricted, so all the leaves and stem material is packed really tightly together, and it has enough energy stored away that it can produce a new plant after a period of dormancy. So in this case, this bladderwort, this is mid-September or so. This is the branch that is being produced, but every time it produces new leaves, it doesn't have any stem material really in between. So it doesn't elongate into a long branch. It just keeps packing on leaf after leaf after leaf, and it stores a lot of energy that way. So the plant will then decay in the fall, and the buds will remain intact. They'll fall to the bottom of the lake, and they'll lay down there away from the ice sheet so they don't freeze. And then in the springtime, they will expand. When they start photosynthesizing again, they'll start expanding, their density will decrease, and they'll start to float up to the surface. So being the dork that I am, I collected some of these in the winter, and I put them in the fridge and made them think that they were going through the winter for 6 weeks or so. And then I brought them out in February and put them into a little glass bowl next to the window inside with tap water in it, and made it think that spring was coming. So this is after 3 days of that turion, of this. These are actually the plants that I collected, I think. 3 days later, those leaves start to unfold, and the stem starts to elongate. And remember, it's got all that energy packed into it, so it doesn't even really need the sun at this point. It just senses the warmth and starts to put that energy into the stem and stretch it out. 10 days, it starts to really look like a little plant now. And then 30 days go by, and it's using the sun in addition to the stored energy now, and it can make a really big plant in a very short period of time. At this point, the plant doesn't really have bladders when it's inside that turion. It's just going to take up space, and they'd be crushed anyway. So the bladders are not produced until later when they're starting to use the energy from the sun to produce those bladders. So down here, there's a couple of little bladders that are just starting to form on here. But for the most part, this is still devoid of any bladders. So we mentioned this one already. This is a freshwater jellyfish, which we do have. Spencer Lake is the closest place to here that's known to have them. I found them there. I had a fisherman bring me a sample, I think it was 2013. He was fishing on Spencer Lake. He was anchored and jigging, so he was just standing there jigging off the boat, and noticed these little jellyfish coming up from the depths and kind of coming up and going back down. And I think after he wiped his eyes a few times, he grabbed one and he brought it in. So I went back out there, and I was able to find more, and I took a video, which I'll attempt to show. And I put out a little press release to just local papers about this, and just because it was interesting. And within hours, I had, I think, 5 radio interviews scheduled for the next day. And it was on national CNN by the end of the day. And of course, they're playing it as like man-eating jellyfish in Spencer Lake. So these things are completely harmless. They're tiny. They're the size of a nickel. And they do have little stinging cells, but they're so small that all they can paralyze with them is a piece of zooplankton. It's not going to hurt you or a dog or a kid or anything. It's only big enough to harm something very, very tiny. But of course, when the headlines read jellyfish found in Wisconsin Lake, it got people pretty excited. So I'll try to show that clip real quick. Yeah, it was in, yeah, my brother called me that night from California and told me he just saw it on the news. So this is 2014, I guess it was. So I'm in my kayak with my underwater camera, and I can't see the screen, so this actually worked out pretty well. But they do, I mean, they look just like a jellyfish. They flutter and move up and down. And where I found this one, they like to be in the cooler water. In this case, the wind was blowing across the lake, and I think what was happening was that as that surface water got pushed one way, the water at the bottom of the lake was being moved the other way. So it was there was this cycle going on in the lake. And right above the drop-off on the opposite side of the lake, these things would get pulled up because they can't swim very well. It's mostly water currents that are moving them around. So they were getting lifted up by the current as that cycle was moving through the water. So kind of a neat thing. It's not native here, but we don't know that of any real damage that they cause. They seem to be pretty much just benign. But nevertheless, an interesting thing. So this thing is known from, as of this spring, I think it was exactly 100 lakes in the state where this is known to be. The Red Granite Quarry is another one that's not too far away. Lake Jonas and Schmeekley Reserve on the Stevens Point campus has had them. That's an interesting lake because it was never stocked with anything. It's a man-made lake, about 4 decades old. But the students have stocked it with everything you can imagine. So basically, the entire fish flora or fish community of Wisconsin is in this little 20-acre lake. It's really interesting to see fish survey data from that lake. So we mentioned caddisflies a little bit earlier. The caddisflies are really interesting creatures in that they build little houses for themselves for the most part. There's one family of caddisflies that doesn't, and that's the one that produces this little pup tent looking thing back here. But all the other ones will produce, they'll build a house out of sticks or aquatic plant stems or sand or things like that, other materials that they find in their habitat, and they carry that around with them. So if they see a predator, they hide inside there and it just looks like a pile of sand or sticks or something. And the predators leave them alone. So here we have some of these sort of igloo-shaped, dome-shaped houses. That's the Glossosomatidae family of caddisflies. There's the little log cabin caddisflies, as they're called. They produce a perfectly square case out of little bits of wood. And this one back here, there's a close-up of that little tent that they make. This is one, the Hydropsychidae family here, that don't produce cases. They actually just hide all day long in a crack in a rock or a log or something like that. And they build this little tent at night, and this will catch junk that floats downstream all day long. And then at night, they'll crawl out of that crack in the rock, and they'll go scrape all that stuff off and eat it. And they'll repair any of that silken web that they need to, and then go back by the morning, and they'll hide in the rock again and just wait for the next day to go back out and clean the net again. So typically these things will collapse when you take a rock out of the water. I was lucky that this one actually stayed standing. But it's just aquatic plant pieces here that they've used to build this little tent and just spun a web in between, just like a spider would. So here you go. The domesticated caddisflies working hard to produce precious metal jewelry. If you put them into an aquarium where they have nothing but precious metals to work from, they will build their house out of whatever they've got. So we've got pearls and gold flakes and all kinds of things. And this is, I think, a woman in England, I think, that sells these online, and it's jewelry. So interesting use of caddisflies. All right, so we talked about sundews again a little bit before. This is a group of, again, carnivorous wetland species. They grow on bogs and on fens, and they trick insects into coming in so they can catch them and eat them. This is a group that produces, they have hairs on their leaves which produce little droplets of glue, really. It smells sweet and it looks like dew. So things will land on them thinking, well, it smells sweet and it looks like nectar, or it looks like morning dew, so maybe go down there for a drink. And when they get attached to that leaf, or when they land on that leaf, they get stuck. And as they struggle, they get more and more stuck. Those hairs will keep hitting them, and they don't let go. And over time, the whole leaf will roll up around the insect and slowly digest it. It will produce enzymes, and basically that glue will be, it'll drown the insect, really. It'll have so much glue around it that it can't breathe. And then it'll secrete enzymes to break down that material. So it'll roll up around it and digest it, and then once everything good is out of that insect's body, it'll unroll again, and the dried carcass will just blow away, and the sundew will secrete more of this glue and catch another bug. There's a, if you've ever seen the Planet Earth series or Discovery Life series, nature documentaries, there's a neat shot of a sundew next to a bog, and they've got this mosquito that's just coming out of the case at the surface of the water, just hatching out. And it's sitting on the water for a second before it takes off, and then it flies off, and then boom, it's right into a sundew. And then that's it. That's game over for the mosquito. Neat video clip that they've got there. All right, I'm going to skip the sundew because that touchpad issue on the computer was scaring me a little bit. There's a couple other ones that I'm hoping to show instead. So this one here, this is a shot from Porter's Lake in Watoma of the water celery. This is a common species that occurs really statewide and nationwide. And it is the primary food source for the canvasback. The canvasback's Latin name is Aethia vallisneria, which is named after Vallisneria americana, the water celery, because of this very strong relationship between the two species. The migratory routes of the canvasback really follow huge populations of water celery as they move north and well, south primarily. They're eating this stuff on their way south in the fall. This has an interesting pollination strategy. It has a female flower that rises up to the surface. This is in Hartman Creek State Park at Allen Lake, taken off by the playground equipment near the dock. It has this female flower that rises up to the surface, and it has this coiled structure to it. Once it reaches near the surface, it stops just short of the surface. You can sort of see this little dimple maybe around that flower. There's a little ring around it. It stops just short of the surface so that surface tension on the water brings it down to form this dimple around the flower itself. And then the males are formed down here at the base of the plant that sometimes is 7 or 8 feet below the surface. And for whatever reason, this plant has pollen that will explode if it touches water. But it develops pollen 8 feet below the water and has to get it to the surface, to the female flower, for pollination to happen. So it creates the male flowers in these little sealed capsules that are very buoyant. And when they detach from the base of the plant, they float up to the surface. And they are sealed until they get up to the surface. When they get there, they open up into these little floating rafts, which is what all these little white things are here. And so here they are. When they rise up to the surface and they form a little boat, the 3 sepals of the flower open up and they curve down, and they form this little floating tripod-looking thing that floats along the surface, and it holds the pollen up on the stamens up to the air so it doesn't touch the water. And the wind or the currents will carry these little floating flowers down the stream or across the lake, and hopefully they will go right into one of those dimples. And if that happens, then the boat will fall into the dimple, and the stamens of the flower will smack the female flower and pollination happens. If that doesn't happen, pollination doesn't happen, and the male flowers will just wash up on shore and rot away and nothing ever happens. So for the most part, water celery reproduces by rhizomes under the soil. It creeps along and sends up a new plant, creeps along and sends up another one. Like a lot of aquatic plants, they reproduce a lot by rhizomes and winter buds and other asexual mechanisms of reproduction. Because this obviously is kind of a crapshoot when you're out there. It might happen, but probably not. So that's what it looks like. 3 little sepals that curve down. The stamens are held up with the pollen on them. And a few years ago, I was lucky enough, I guess, lucky if you're me, I guess, to be out on a lake and found the females and the males at the same time, and was able to get a picture of both. So here's that little tripod with the stamens pointing up, and then this giant female flower. So the dimple is actually pretty big. You got a pretty good shot at finding a dimple, I guess, if you're one of these tiny little flowers. All right, so what are these? Dragonflies. What's the difference between a dragonfly and a damselfly? The wings on a dragonfly are out to the side, and the damselfly holds its wings off of its back. In general, there's a group of damsels called the spread wings, which are just, they don't want to obey the rules. So they have spread wings as well. But in general, the dragonflies land like this with their wings spread out to the side. So these are somewhat large insects. They can get to 4 or 5 inch wingspan, sometimes maybe a little bit bigger than that. Some of them are migratory. They live for multiple years and they migrate to the south and they come back in the spring. Just like the loons and many other things do. They will fly down there and come back. The dragonfly is really cool because it can fly in any direction, up and down, flip forward and backward. Very, very fast. They're very good predators of aquatic insects and other things that are flying around above the water or near the water. They're predatory larvae as well, so they live in the water for a short time, sometimes up to a year in the water, and they eat other aquatic insects and sometimes even little tadpoles and fish and things they will consume if it's a large one. And then they crawl up on something in the summer, in this case a dock. The larva crawls up, it hooks its little claws, each leg has a couple of hooks in it. It hooks those into some wood or a plant stem or something, and cements itself really well to that surface, and then just dries out in the sun, and the adult pops out of that case. When it dries up, it starts to split, and the adult comes out right out of the back of that larva. So this is an emerging adult here. And I took a video of this once, which I won't show you because it turned out to be about 1.5 hours long, where I sat in a kayak and watched this happen. And I was thinking, when I saw what was happening, I saw the larva crawl out onto a plant, and I thought, well, this is going to be a really cool video. And it just took forever to happen. So it takes a long time. But over time, this thing will pop out. Probably takes about 10 minutes or so just for that emergence of that bug to come out of the case. And then it'll dry its wings and pump them full of the insect blood for a little while, and once it's got the wings fully expanded and warmed up and full of blood, then it can fly away. So I'm hoping to show you this, because again, being the dork that I am, I had a pet dragonfly larva for a while, before I had children. And I wasn't married at the time either. Maybe I'll try that at the end of the presentation. I'll pull up a couple of videos. The dragonflies have a jaw that is hinged underneath their head. It's like an elbow underneath, and it kind of holds they've got kind of a mask on, and they can reach their long jaw out and grab things. So they've got a couple of claws on the end, and they can shoot this thing out so that at real-time speed, you don't even see it move. There's a bug in front of it, and then there isn't a bug in front of it. And so it's at 250 frames per second. It's still fast in the video, but you can get an idea of what this jaw looks like when it reaches out there and grabs this thing. So I had caught a little isopod, a little aquatic bug, and fed it with the tweezers. And so if the video plays at the end, you'll get to see that jaw shoot out, and it actually grabs the tweezers, and it lifts its whole body off the ground because the jaw is so strong. And it missed the bug, but I gave it to him at the end for good effort. So this one, again, I had a video that I linked to that maybe I can show at the end. This one is called bog laurel. It's one of my favorite wetland species. It's a beautiful flower, pink and black. And it occurs in bogs, acid bogs, so where cranberries and leatherleaf and things would grow. And it's usually the first species to bloom. So in central Wisconsin, we'll see this blooming at the early part of May. When really nothing else is blooming and many things haven't even started growing yet, this thing will be blooming. It's an evergreen species, so it's already ready to go in the spring, and it just flowers as soon as the weather is warm enough that it warms up the plant. And this one has these stamens here that are tucked into the flowers. As the flower develops, the stamens are tucked into the petals so that they're actually held under tension as the flower grows. And when a bee lands on the center part here, it kind of shakes the flower and it'll trip these stamens, or its legs will hook onto the stamens and pull them. And since they're held under tension, they will come up and slap the side of the insect and deposit pollen on the side of the bee. So every time they go to a new flower, they get whacked with a few more of these stamens and more pollen gets accumulated on them. And they'll just fly from flower to flower, getting assaulted by all these flowers and pollinating them at the same time. So there's a video from a European species of Kalmia, not the one that we have, but there's a video of them using a toothpick to trip these little stamens, and you can see them flip up. All right, what about this? Has anyone seen one of these before? They're fairly common. Not a lightning bug. Similar, sometimes they're called electric light bugs and other things like that because they will be attracted to lights in the evening. So sometimes people will see these on their porch. You'll step outside and see this 3.5-inch long bug sitting on the ground. This is an aquatic insect, but they do fly to shore occasionally when they're mature. And it's called the giant water bug. That's my hand, so you can get an idea of the size of these things when they're big. And they lay eggs on things around the water, sticks and things around the water. So that's a water lily rhizome that floated up to the surface. And they laid the eggs on the underside of that rhizome. If you look really hard right here, there's a fishing spider. We'll talk about fishing spiders a little bit too. But this is a smart little spider because it just sat there waiting for each one of the eggs to hatch, and then as soon as the egg hatched, it went and grabbed the little hatchling bug. But typically the male will guard those eggs. So this guy is watching over those eggs. And they don't really go out of the water, they'd be under the water. So the fishing spider can go underwater and above. So it would probably just retreat if it saw the male coming. It could just go above water and get out of the way. But these are large aquatic insects, and they will attack pretty big prey. They do have venom, and they have very large, grasping forelegs. So you can see it pretty well in this shot here. These look at those biceps on this thing. They're pretty strong. So they can grab prey of various kinds, fish or whatever it is. They grab onto it, and then they pierce it with a little beak. They've got a little stinger, if you want to call it that, a little appendage that's on the front of the mouth that's right here. So it can kind of stab this little needle into the prey and then inject the venom. So it can attack something as big as a toad and take it out because it's got the venom in addition to just the power of the bug itself. This is an ambush predator insect, so it will often sit at the top of the water. It's got a little breathing tube. It can breathe out of its butt. Try that at home. It can go underwater and stick that thing out of the water and just wait for something to go by. So it can keep breathing as it just waits. So it'll sit there and not move until something goes by, and then it can reach out those huge legs and grab things. So sometimes they're called toe biters, because if you step on one, it'll poke you. They're not aggressive in any way if they won't target your foot or something, or swimmers. But like anything, if you get stepped on, you get defensive. All right, so the fishing spider we mentioned already. This is a neat spider in that it can walk on water, and it can do this cool thing called ballooning. And ballooning is where I saw this happen once. Before I knew what this was, I saw it happen, which made me go on the internet and try to figure out what did I just see, because that was really unusual. But I was putting my kayak in at North Lake in Wapaka County 7 or 8 years ago, probably. And on the right side of the boat landing, there's a patch of cattails, and then there's an open water area where the boats go through, so there wasn't really any vegetation. And then there was lily pads on the left side. And as I was going through the cattails, I was doing a plant survey out there, so I was looking at all the plants, and I was right up against the cattails, and this fishing spider was on the water, and it shot out a silk thread into the air, and then just got lifted off, and it floated all over that open water area and came down on the lily pads. And I thought, that was the coolest thing. So I went home and I figured out that this is what I have, a 6-spotted fishing spider. And they actually have spots underneath, which is where there's 6. You might count those and say, oh, that's a stupid name. But the spots are underneath. But yeah, it can do this thing called ballooning, where it can actually transport itself over the water to another area to avoid probably fish in that case. That open water, it'd be hard to run over the water and not have a bluegill or something come up and grab it. So I was able to just fly over the open water and come down in a more favorable location. So they're really interesting. These species will get, especially on river systems, will get to 3 or 4 inches in diameter, including the legs, not just the body. So they can get pretty big, and they will attack things like minnows and little tadpoles and things like that, water striders or other things that might be skating around on the water near them. So they usually sit on a stick or something, or vegetation right along the edge, and they'll grab something as it goes by. Again, they're not going to grab you. They're grabbing little insects and tiny things that they can handle. All right, what's this?
Freshwater sponge.
A sponge. We have many sponges in freshwater. They're certainly more common in the ocean, where people think of sponges to occur, but we do have native sponges. This is another Porter's Lake photo down in Watoma. Sponges are animals, and they are green because they have algae growing inside the tissue of the sponge itself. So you look at it thinking it might be a plant, but it's actually just tiny plants inside the animal tissue that makes it green. And these are little filter feeders, much like those Bryozoans that we talked about earlier. In flowing water, they're usually kind of a cushion on the bottom side of a rock. So you'll pull a rock out of a stream, and you'll see this kind of slimy green stuff on it. It could be algae, but if it's a sponge, it'll usually be a little circle that's very spongy and green. But in a lake, they usually form these little fingers that pop out of the sediments. And sometimes these can look like a mop head that's sticking upside down out of the bottom of the lake. They can get very, very big. And usually this happens in lakes where there's good water quality. We do have a fair bit of them in the chain. I always find them in the upper chain when I lead field trips out there. And a lot of lakes with good water quality around here have these. They're fairly common. So here's a shot from Wadley Lake in Marathon County. That is a big one. That's probably 10 to 12 inches tall from here to the tip. And then this is one in flowing water where it's more of that cushiony appearance to it. Different species. And then there's the hermit crab sponge, which grows on hermit crabs, which obviously is not a freshwater sponge species. But for the most part, these things are sessile, which means that they don't move. Once they're settled on an area, they grow there and they can't move themselves. These ones are sort of a weird exception because they aren't moving themselves, but they are moving when the crab moves. And again, not something that occurs around here. All right, what's this one? Yeah, poison sumac. This is a large shrub that occurs in fens, or groundwater-fed PD areas. And it's actually in the cashew family. It has these large compound leaves and these berries that hang underneath. This is something that I have unfortunately gotten twice. Even though I know exactly how to identify it, I still ended up getting it twice. It has gorgeous red leaves in the fall. It's a brilliant shrub in the fall season from a distance. And so this is after I was collecting some moss about 20 feet from a poison sumac. And I think what happened was there were leaves or berries or something in the soil that had decayed, and residual chemical in that plant material was in the soil. So everywhere that my arms were touching the soil, I got this poison sumac. And it forms these big blisters and rashes, and it's about 5 days of hydrocortisone if you get it. It's a nasty itch that you get from it. This one here is something that I had growing at my house at the time that I got that poison sumac, and I thought, okay, I'm going to wipe the Jewelweed on my arms. I guess I gave away that one. Because that does have an anti-itch property, and I thought, this is great. I'm gonna chew up a whole bunch of this stuff and just slather it on myself. Well, it didn't do anything with poison sumac. It's not strong enough. But this is a plant that has these neat little orange flowers. There's a yellow one also that grows in the woods, more upland areas. And it has a swollen stem, as you can see here, where the joints are full of a watery sap that has anti-itch properties. So when you encounter stinging nettle or something with a fairly minor itch, you can use this stuff to break the stem open near the base where the most sap is, and you wipe that on, and it'll take away the itch. So it's a neat plant to have around. It also typically grows very close to where stinging nettle grows. So if you run into it, you can probably find some jewelweed nearby. And I have a video of that in slow motion that I'm hoping to show at the end. Yeah. Yeah. All right, what's this little guy? A wood frog, yep. Wood frogs have the black stripe that goes through the eye here. They're 2 inches or so, 2.5 inches maybe. They sound like a duck or like a laughing duck in the springtime. It's a really neat sound. It's my favorite one to listen to in the spring. It's really typically the first frog to call. Right when the peepers start calling, or just before the peepers even, you'll have these ones out there calling as well. They freeze solid through the winter. They crawl up onto the shore. They sit in a bunch of organic material on the shore, leaves and things. They burrow in there and they freeze like a rock. And they produce an antifreeze compound in their system so that there's a little bit of antifreeze around each organ, and the rest of the frog freezes solid. So it protects the organs, but the rest of the frog is as hard as a rock. And once they thaw out in the spring, the first thing they do is hop over to the pond and they start calling for a mate. So it happens the first nice warm day of the spring. These things start looking for a small pool to start calling from and mating. So it happens very early in the season. And this is an interesting frog in that the populations seem to favor a gradual decrease in temperature throughout the year. And if it suddenly gets very cold, many of them will freeze solid. Their organs will freeze. But basically because they don't have enough time to produce the antifreeze and adapt to that cold condition. So the more gradual the cold comes in the fall, the better it is for the wood frogs. All right. Has anyone seen these zigzagging in front of a pontoon boat as you're going around a lake? This is called the whirligig beetle. You see them all the time when you're on a boat going along through shallow water. You'll see them just going back and forth. It seems like they're trying to outrun the boat, but they're just staying in the same spot the whole time, a few feet ahead of you. These are neat little insects. They're very, very shiny and very smooth. They're very hard to catch, and once you catch one, they're very hard to hold on to because they're so slippery. And they zigzag just to avoid predation. So they have a very weird, unpredictable swimming pattern. And they have 2 sets of eyes. So they can look for prey under the water with 2 eyes, and they can look for predators above the water with the other 2 eyes. I don't know what the TV screen in their head looks like, but they're able to do both things at once, which is really interesting.
I love hearing the wood frogs too.
Yeah.
But how do they know when you're coming? Because they can be quacking away,
Yep.
and then as soon as I get sort of close, it's all silent.
Right.
How do they know you're coming?
Yeah, I think it's just their eyes. The frog's eyes are positioned so they can see pretty much anywhere around their body. And they have to be watching for herons at any time. Or it could be a mink or anything that might be near the shore. that could be grabbing them. So yeah, typically if they see something getting close or they hear something, they obviously have good hearing. They hear something get close, then they stop calling so they don't give away their location. And if you leave, then they'll start calling again when they see the coast is clear. Yeah.
I've never seen fish go after the water bugs, the jitterbug.
Yeah, it's a pretty formidable prey. I mean, if they got caught on the wrong end of it, it could get poked. I don't know of anything that eats them. I've never observed it myself. I would guess that some fairly aggressive predators, large bass or northerns or muskies or something, might target them. But I think they're not very big, but I think they're well respected in the aquatic food web. Yeah.
Hi. While kayaking up north, there was a reservoir that was full of large bladder things, much bigger than a basketball, attached to logs and other things. And they were smooth, not little bumpy things like the one that you showed us. And I wondered if you could tell me what they were, because I know eventually they let the water out to kill those things, whatever it was.
Well, I think it probably was a Bryozoan. It could have been a different species that's a little bit smoother. Typically, they're very smooth and slimy feeling on the outside, even though they have that sort of coral-like appearance. I'm guessing that's probably what it was, even though it was bigger and smoother. There really isn't another thing, unless it was a green blob where it would be some sort of algae related. But if it was it clear like the? Clear. Yeah. So it was probably just a large Bryozoan colony. They can get, I mean, basketball size or slightly larger than that. And reservoirs are typically where you'd see the largest ones occurring too. They like to be where there's a little bit of flow, because as filter feeders, there's constantly food being brought right to them. And so in those slow flow systems, they can get much bigger than they would in a non-flowing system. But I'm guessing that's probably what it was. If you have a picture of it, I'd love to see the picture, and maybe I could have another guess at it. Okay.
Paul, could you tell the audience about that new plant that you discovered, never been found in the Western Hemisphere before?
Right, okay, so in 2012, I came across an aquatic plant in Adams County that was about 7 feet tall that I couldn't identify, and I spent about 6 weeks at least trying to figure out what this thing was. And I finally got so desperate, I just sent a picture of it to everyone I knew and said, if you don't know what it is, send it out to everyone you know. And maybe with somebody you'll finally figure out what this thing is. And it landed on the desk of somebody at the New York Botanical Garden who studies this very specific group of large algae in lakes. And this particular group is thought to be an evolutionary link between algae and land plants. It's a type of algae, but it has a central stem and it has little branches and things, and it looks like a vascular plant, but it's actually an algae. And so he was able to identify it for me, and we've been working ever since now on this particular group of algae in Wisconsin lakes. But yeah, it was only known from fossil evidence in the Americas. It had never been seen growing alive before in thousands of years. So it was exciting that it was still growing here. And I asked the person this lake actually had an annual aquatic plant survey done for many years prior to this. And again, this is a 7-foot tall plant. And I said, well, didn't you see this during the plant survey? And she said, well, I saw it all the time. It's the dominant species out there, and I called it weird Cara. And Cara is a different species, different group of species. She just thought it was an unusual form of that group. And so she just wrote it down as that and never collected a specimen and submitted it or anything. So we recently published a paper on that in American Journal of Botany. No, it was not a new species. So it's a worldwide endangered species in its native range. So it's native to several countries in Europe, and there was just a handful of populations left in the world, and then here it shows up in Adams County. And we actually now know of more populations in Wisconsin than we do in the rest of the world combined. It's actually somewhat common in the right habitat in Wisconsin. Yeah. So, we don't think so. As I said, there's fossil evidence of it from the Americas. And as far as we can tell, it seems to be a native species, but we're doing various kinds of work to try to answer that question for sure.
A windy day like today, Paul, has provided 1 trillion needles coming mainly off of white pines. Are these trees so stressed that that's why they're doing it now?
I would say that's probably a likely answer. The heat stress and moisture stress, they may be losing a bunch of needles to conserve water. Yeah, and pine trees lose needles continuously. The needles will sit on the tree for several years, and they just shed them continuously a little bit at a time. But that is a response that trees can use to reduce water loss, is to lose some of their leaves or some of their needles. So that's possible, yeah.
Do you mind Do you mind talking about bullfrogs? I want to ask a question, but I live on a lake that for 50 years and I've never had bullfrogs. I'm very happy until this spring. I can hear 2 of them calling, and I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of them. You can mention the negative problems of bullfrogs.
So you were happy that you didn't have bullfrogs? Okay. Bullfrogs are a native species in Wisconsin, and they are the largest frog that we have here. They can outstretch, they can get to 9-10 inches long, they can get very big. They'll eat other frogs, they'll eat fish, all kinds of things. Whatever they can fit in their big mouth, they will eat. I don't know that I can elaborate much on negative impacts, because they are a native species. They're invasive in other countries where they've been introduced as pets and let go. And now they're causing all kinds of problems there.
Well, I've heard that I could say goodbye to all the other species of frogs because they're so carnivorous and smaller frogs. Anyway, the other negative is that they're spreading some disease.
Okay, probably the chytrid fungus. Chytrid fungus is a species that is a non-native species of fungus that has arrived via international trade and things like many other invasive organisms do. And it impacts a lot of amphibians, and bullfrogs are one of many that it can infect. The introduction of an infected bullfrog to an uninfected wetland would be a concern, but really no more concern than an infected pickerel frog or green frog or anything else that would be introduced into that wetland.
Have you ever tried catching them?
I have. They're tough to catch. They're smart.
In a canoe, or were you walking?
I was in a small pontoon boat, or a rowboat. I was in a rowboat on that lake. Yeah. And once you get them in the net, they can jump so far that they'll jump right out of the net. So, yeah, they're tricky.
My question was about spotted knotweed. No, not spotted knotweed. The jewelweed.
Okay.
What part of the plant do you have to pick in order to get rid of your itch?
The stem. So the swollen joints of the stem have the most sap in them. The base of the plant, it gets thicker as it goes toward the base. So you want to get the base of the plant, and then you crush it up, and all the juice, the sap that comes out is the anti-itch stuff. So you wipe that on your skin. Yep.
Is purple loosestrife becoming native now?
Well, that's an interesting question. Purple loosestrife is a non-native species. It is a European plant that was introduced as a garden species for wet sites, and it's been around for decades. Also, for at least a decade, we've been releasing beetles that are native to Europe, that are native predators of purple loosestrife, and those have been controlling the purple loosestrife. And thankfully, the beetles only eat purple loosestrife and grandkids, so we're doing fine. So as they eat the loosestrife, they decrease its ability to flower and spread and produce seed. They decrease the height, they decrease the amount of flowers that it produces. So at some point, invasives sometimes become what's called naturalized, which they're not native, but they're sort of becoming part of the community. And that happens because there's some kind of stressors like bugs or diseases or something that starts to attack them, and it pulls their population down enough that other things can compete with them again. So no, it'll never be native, but it's becoming perhaps on the road to being naturalized because the beetles are doing a very good job controlling it. They don't eradicate it. Any biocontrol organism is not going to eat all of its food, so it will control it and it'll keep the population down, but it's always going to be there. And the goal is really, if you can reduce the purple loosestrife enough that it's not causing any big problems, then it's just another plant out there. So,
well, there are a whole bunch in the median on the freeways.
Yeah.
But we have a wonderful initiative right here in Waupaca. Wonderful naturalists work very hard to raise those weevils. They're weevils.
Beetles. No, they're not weevils.
Beetles, okay. And they, so they release them at a very precise time. And they do their thing, and it's working.
Yep.
Very exciting.
Is there interest in the plants in lakes too, like in oceans for eating? I thought of the celery. Is anyone, do people eat it?
Farming, water celery.
Wild celery is not edible to my knowledge.
Okay, that's all right.
Every plant is edible at least once. Wild celery, kind of slimy. When you crush the leaves, it's kind of slimy. It looks tasty, but it probably wouldn't be. There are other pondweeds that are probably a little crunchier and more appropriate for a salad or something. Watercress is a species that's not native here, but does occur in a lot of our cool water streams and along lakes where there's cold springs. That is an edible aquatic green. It's the same species that you'd buy in the grocery store. It grows all over the place and wherever it's cold. That's the only one that I'm aware of that where you eat the foliage. There's other species like arrowheads or duck potatoes where you can harvest the tubers of the plant. And those are relished by waterfowl and other mammals and things that eat those things in the fall. But you can also harvest those and you can cook them like potatoes. It's just really a starch reserve like a potato. So you can harvest those too.
The jellyfish, your slide said they originally came from China. Do we have any idea how they got here?
Yeah, we think we know. So jellyfish don't leave any fossils behind because they're all just jelly and water. They don't have any cartilage or bones or anything. They're originally from the Yangtze River. We know they're native there in China. And the first place that they were showing up outside of that region was in a botanical garden in England. And that place, the tank where they showed up was a newly constructed pond where they imported driftwood and water lilies into. So the thought is that they occurred as polyps. They occur as polyps for most of their life cycle. They're just attached to something on the bottom of the lake. And they were probably just introduced as polyps attached to driftwood or water lily tubers or rhizomes or something. And then when that material was introduced, the jellyfish then matured out of their polyp stage and were found in the pond. So how did they get over here? Probably the same method, people importing Asian plants or plant stock, driftwood, anything else that might have been taken from an aquatic system there and brought here. That's a very common way that we get all kinds of weird species. Lots of our invasives come that way, where somebody introduces one thing and unintentionally brings another thing with it.
Paul, can you talk about the invasive aquatic plants that occur in the chain of lakes here?
Sure. So the big ones are Eurasian milfoil and curly leaf pondweed. There's also things like yellow iris and Japanese knotweed, Bob, I think is on the chain too. So the big ones being the Eurasian milfoil and the curly leaf. Eurasian milfoil is a very feathery aquatic plant that was introduced in the 60s to Wisconsin as an aquarium release. It was sold for decades as an aquarium plant, and it's illegal and always has been to dump aquariums into local waterways, but people have done it and probably continue to do it. So now it's in about 800 or so lakes in the state, and it spreads very readily by fragmentation. So that's the way that it spreads mostly throughout a lake, is just by breaking itself into pieces or getting broken up by props or waves or fish, turtles, anything really could go through it and break it into pieces. And every little piece where there's a piece of stem attached to a leaf can produce a new root from that piece, and then it can establish a new plant. The curly leaf pondweed is another species that was sold as an aquarium plant for a while. Also perhaps introduced when the common carp was stocked intentionally into Wisconsin lakes back in the 1800s as a game fish. interesting how our perceptions have changed on that one. But they occur together in Europe and often, or potentially were moved together when those fish were stocked. And the curly leaf is an interesting one in that it grows from typically October through June, and it's a cold water specialist, so it produces those winter buds really in the summer. And it has a dormant bud that lays on the bottom of the lake from June, or late June through October, and then comes back in the fall and grows. It doesn't really grow under the ice, but survives in a dormant state under the ice, and then immediately starts growing as soon as the ice is off. So that's an interesting one. Is there anything else that you wanted me to touch on, or? Okay. Okay.
Any more questions?
Back to this algae, you said it's 7 feet long?
Yeah.
That's underwater, everything's underwater?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And there's another species that, actually there's one that may be completely new to science, period, across the world, never been described before, that we found in Wetlands County. And there's another one that was collected by Hugh Iltis in 1960, who is a famous Wisconsin botanist. And he collected one in Marquette County, and he just labeled it as Cara sp, which means unknown species of Cara. And it turned out to be this very rare species that's endemic to this area. So it only occurs in the world in the Midwest. And I believe there are 3 locations, Michigan and northern Indiana, where the species is known to still survive. But then I found it back at that same site. I saw this specimen he collected and went back to that site and I found it. And then I went to 4 more sites around the state with the same habitat and found it all 4 of those as well. So now there are 8 populations in the whole world, but better than 3, I suppose. But these are really interesting algae because they don't, it's not what people usually think of as algae. It's not slimy masses that float around in lakes. It's these large plants. Cara is an extremely common species or a group of species that's in the chain and really any hardwater lake around here. It forms kind of a gritty, musky smelling carpet on the bottom of lakes. Most of the time these species are 6 inches to maybe 10 inches tall, so they don't cause any real problems really. These other species that are very tall, they're unusual when they get that high, but they can get that tall. And they have, on this big stem that they have, between their whorls of leaves or their rings of leaves, they can have 10 or 12 or 14 inches between, and that's all one cell. It's a single cell that's a foot long. So a lot of what we know about cell physiology and communication between cells and things is known because we're able to study these huge cells of these large algae. And you can connect electrodes to them and kind of watch things transport through the cell and how they're communicating and things. So it's really been a really important group of algae for science, just to understand how cells work.
Paul, can you define the difference between a plant and algae for everybody? I know
Sure.
there's some people here who
Okay.
don't know the
Yep, so
difference.
when I say plant, I'm talking about something that flowers and produces seed in some way and has vascular tissues where it has basically cells inside the stem that move water and nutrients back and forth through the plant, moves sugars from the leaves that are produced by photosynthesis down through the plant to the roots and back and forth. And algae don't do that. They don't flower. They produce by spores. They reproduce by spores. They don't have any kind of really conductive mechanisms throughout the plant. They absorb things right through the cell walls of the individual cells. So the Cara, for example, it is laying down there on the bottom of the chain right now, absorbing tons of nutrients right from the water column that would otherwise be absorbed by filamentous algae, slime-forming algae, blue-green algae, which are the toxic kinds, things like that are also after those same nutrients. The Cara mats are really absorbing a lot of that and competing directly with those species. They also form that firm mat that they produce also holds things like fragments of Eurasian water milfoil away from the sediments so that they can't successfully root into the sediments. They'll hold them up until they basically exhaust their energy supply. So it's kind of a protective layer on the bottom of the lake as well. And they hold sediments down so the sediments aren't resuspended. It doesn't cloud the water. It doesn't release phosphorus back from the sediments into the water. So they have all kinds of benefits to the lake system.
Let's give Paul a round of applause.